Testimony that was deliberately suppressed for 73 years was revealed by sealed court records from St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. Identical underground chambers beneath what appeared to be ordinary plantation storage cellars were described by 26 women, ranging in age from 14 to 38. The same architectural details were mentioned in each account: iron rings embedded in limestone walls at precise intervals, brick archways barely 5 feet high, and wooden examination tables with leather restraints worn smooth from decades of use. Particularly disturbing about these testimonies is not what these women endured, but what they were forced to produce. Medical records discovered in 1934 documented systematic procedures that turned human beings into commodities through methods that violated every principle of decency, yet remained entirely legal under Louisiana law until 1865. Detailed ledgers, breeding charts, and correspondence with similar operations across 7 southern states were left behind by the architects of this system. Consider, before we continue with the story of Bellamont Plantation and the carefully calculated horror that unfolded beneath its manicured lawns, that what you're about to hear was not the work of a single madman, but a lucrative business model shared among Louisiana's wealthiest families. Your perspective on this dark chapter of American history matters if you're listening from Louisiana, Mississippi, or anywhere in the Deep South. Leave a comment telling us your state or city. And please subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, because stories like this need to be remembered, not buried. An uncomfortable truth about antebellum economics, one that goes beyond the already horrific realities of slavery, is forced upon us by the systematic nature of what happened at Bellamont. Into territory that most historians prefer to discuss only in clinical terms. The apex of Louisiana's cotton economy in 1837 was represented by St. Landry Parish. Yields that made plantation owners among the wealthiest men in North America were produced by the region's alluvial soil. Sprawling across 4,000 acres along Bayou Teche was Bellamont Plantation, established in 1791 by the DeVoe family. The family's status was proclaimed to anyone traveling the river road by the main house, a stunning example of Creole architecture with wide galleries and Doric columns. Belmont was owned by Augustine DeVoe III, a 47-year-old widower whose business acumen was respected throughout the parish by the late 1830s. Unlike many plantation owners who left daily operations to overseers, Augustine maintained meticulous control over every aspect of Belmont. He served on the parish police jury, kept detailed records, and corresponded with agricultural societies. A model of efficiency and propriety was how his neighbors considered him. 137 souls numbered the plantation's enslaved population in 1837. Remarkably stable appeared Bellamont's enslaved community, unlike some neighboring estates that suffered high mortality rates and constant runaways. Comments on how well-fed and healthy Bellamont's people seemed compared to those from other plantations were drawn by the Sunday market at nearby Opelousas. As something to be emulated, Augustine's reputation for good management of his human property was discussed at gentlemen's clubs and agricultural meetings. Bellamont's unusual profitability was what made this reputation particularly significant. The constant need to purchase new workers to replace those who died or became too old to work productively was a struggle for other plantations with the economic realities of maintaining a large enslaved workforce. Bellamont seemed to grow its workforce internally at a rate that defied standard calculations. Without significant purchases at auction, the plantation's enslaved population nearly doubled between 1825 and 1845. Traditional Louisiana architecture was reflected in the plantation's physical layout. The main house sat elevated on brick pillars surrounded by dependencies, the kitchen building, overseer's house, and a schoolhouse where Augustine's 3 daughters received their education. In 2 neat rows of whitewashed cabins stood the quarters, further from the main house. The industrial area near the river landing occupied the sugar mill, cotton press, and various storage buildings. But it was the root cellar complex built into the slight elevation behind the main house that distinguished Bellamont from neighboring plantations. Extensively renovated by Augustine in 1828 were these underground chambers, ostensibly to create ideal storage conditions for the plantation's wine collection and provisions. Skilled brickmasons from New Orleans were employed for the project, which took 8 months. The resulting structure's clever ventilation system and temperature stability were admired by neighbors. 3 separate entrances or walls 3 feet thick were never questioned as to why such an elaborate cellar complex required. The curious were satisfied by the explanations Augustine provided: controlling humidity, preventing spoilage, protecting valuable stores. After all, the finest facilities for his extensive wine collection and imported goods would naturally be wanted by a man of his wealth and sophistication. A regime that appeared on the surface less brutal than many neighboring plantations was lived under by the enslaved community at Belmont. The rations were adequate, the clothing provided regularly, and medical attention given by a physician who visited monthly. Time for family, worship, and small garden plots was allowed on Sunday afternoons. Its own form of control was generated by this comparative leniency. Belmont's enslaved people knew their situation could be far worse. Starvation rations, brutal punishments, and vicious overseers were known from other plantations. Over anyone who might consider resistance hung the threat of being sold to such places. Yet certain patterns were visible to those who looked carefully. With unusual frequency, young women, particularly those between ages 15 and 25, disappeared from fieldwork. That they were being trained for house service or specialized tasks was the official explanation. They would vanish for weeks or months, then return to appear in the quarters, often pregnant. Multiple times, some women went through this cycle. Among themselves, the community whispered, but the fear of separation and sale kept questions unspoken in the presence of white authority. For the substantial sum of $800, Marie Trosclair arrived at Belmont in March 1837, purchased at the New Orleans slave market. Qualities that made her valuable were possessed by her at 19, literacy in French and English, training as a seamstress, and what the bill of sale described as excellent breeding potential. With relative kindness, her previous owner, a widow settling debts in the city, had treated her household slaves. Comparable might be her new situation, Marie expected. This hope was reinforced by her first weeks at Belmont. Making clothing for the plantation, she was assigned to the sewing house, a comfortable building where she worked alongside 3 other women. Indoors and skilled, the work was far preferable to field labor. Her needlework was even complimented by Augustine's daughters. That she might build something resembling a life here, might eventually marry one of the skilled craftsmen among the enslaved population, might have children who could learn trades rather than spend their lives chopping cotton was what Marie began to believe. Then, on a humid evening in late April, the overseer, a lean man named Virgil Landry, came to the sewing house after the other women had left. A lantern was carried by him and he spoke in the formal, careful tone that white men used when issuing orders that brooked no discussion. "Master DeVoe requires your presence in the main house cellar. Bring nothing. Come with me now." Less than 5 minutes took the walk from the sewing house to the main residence. But possibilities were raced through by Marie's mind. Something wrong had she done? Was she being punished? Sold away already? Visible were other enslaved people returning from their tasks, the evening still light enough, but none met her eyes as Landry led her past the main house to the hillside structure behind it. A heavy oak door set into the earth, reinforced with iron straps, was the entrance. A key from his vest was produced by Landry and he unlocked it, gesturing for Marie to descend the brick steps that disappeared into darkness. An odd smell, medicinal almost, mixed with something organic she couldn't identify, was carried by the cool air that rose from below. "Keep moving," said Landry behind her, his lantern casting their shadows long against the brick walls. About 12 feet descended the stairs before opening into a corridor. Slightly forcing Marie to duck was the low ceiling. Expertly laid brick were the walls, the floor smooth limestone. Steady light was provided by oil lamps in wall sconces. About 30 feet extended the corridor before reaching a heavy door. A chamber that defied everything Marie understood about plantation architecture lay through that door. Perhaps 20-foot square was the room with a ceiling reinforced by brick arches. Along one wall stood shelves holding medical instruments, bottles of various liquids, and neatly labeled jars. A peculiar piece of furniture, something between an examination table and a restraining device made of polished wood with leather straps at various points, sat in the center of the room. But what drew Marie's attention was the woman already in the room. Wearing only a thin shift stood Eileen, one of the house servants, near the wall. Perhaps 25 was she, her belly swollen with pregnancy in its late stages. Carefully blank was her face, the expression of someone who had learned not to react. Near a small desk stood Augustine DeVoe, writing in a leather-bound ledger. He looked up as Marie entered, and his expression was businesslike, almost clinical. "Marie, you come with excellent references regarding your intelligence and health. What you are about to learn is the source of Bellemont's prosperity. You will cooperate fully or you will be sold to the Saunier Plantation in Avoyelles Parish, where I understand the mortality rate for field workers is quite remarkable. Do you understand?" Nodded Marie, her throat too tight for speech. "Good. Helen here is about to deliver her fourth child for Bellemont. You will assist Dr. Prudhomme, who will arrive shortly. This will be your introduction to your new primary duty." The truth about Bellemont's unusual profitability was learned by Marie over the next several hours. With scientific precision, the plantation was not merely using enslaved women's reproductive capacity naturally, it was systematically managing it. With the detached tone of a professor discussing agricultural breeding, Dr. Prudhomme, a thin man in his 60s with ink-stained fingers, explained the process. At around 15 or 16, young women of good health and physique were selected. Thoroughly examined were they when brought to the basement chambers. Measurements taken, physical characteristics documented, health assessed. Then specifically chosen for desirable traits, height, strength, even temperament or particular skills, they were assigned to one of several enslaved men. Across multiple generations, extensive charts that tracked lineage documented the pairings. Superior rations heavy in protein and milk were received by the women living in a separate section of the quarters. Carefully monitored were their pregnancies, with Dr. Prudhomme visiting weekly. Under conditions far more sanitary than typical plantation births, they gave birth in the basement chambers. Meticulously documented were the resulting children, every physical characteristic, every sign of health or weakness recorded. Skilled laborers or breeders themselves would be raised as the boys. At 15, the girls would enter the program. A population of enslaved people custom-designed for specific purposes had been created by Augustine within a single generation: field workers with exceptional endurance, house servants with particular physical appearances, craftsmen with inherited aptitudes. But the true genius of the system, Augustine explained to Marie that night with evident pride, was in the economics. 8 to 10 children during her prime years could be produced by a healthy female in the program. A return of $5,000 to $8,000 was represented by each woman at market prices of $600 to $1,000 per child by age 10. Exceeding that of cotton by a significant factor was the profit margin when costs of upkeep and medical care were subtracted. "Cotton wears out the soil," said Augustine, sipping brandy as Dr. Prudhomme cleaned his instruments. "But this is renewable wealth, self-generating capital. Several plantations in the parish have adopted similar systems after seeing my results. We are, in essence, creating an entirely new economic model." Multifaceted would be Marie's role, she learned. Valuable for maintaining the breeding records was her literacy. Creating the special garments used during pregnancies would be employed with her needlework skills. And given her own health and characteristics, she would herself enter the program within the month. With the same careful consideration one might use discussing the mating of prize horses was the selection of her pairing described to her. Decided by Augustine after reviewing his charts and consulting his records was that she would be paired with a blacksmith named Cyrus, a man of 32 who had already sired 7 healthy children through the program. Children of exceptional value might be produced, Augustine theorized, by the combination of Marie's intelligence and Cyrus's physical strength. That she had entered a nightmare with no escape was understood by Marie that night, returning to her cabin in the quarters. She could refuse, but refusal meant sale to a plantation where life expectancy for field workers rarely exceeded 7 years. She could run, but merciless toward runaways was Louisiana law, and the penalties extended to anyone who might have helped her. She could resist, but resistance would simply mean she would be restrained during the procedures Augustine had planned. These calculations had already been learned by the other women in the program. Over the following weeks, them did Marie meet. 17 women of various ages, all sharing the particular look of those who had learned to separate themselves psychologically from what was happening to their bodies. In quiet voices, they spoke about strategies for survival. How to maintain dignity when dignity was being systematically stripped away. How to love children who would never fully belong to you. How to endure the monthly examinations and the forced pairings and the constant documentation of your body's functions. Since its inception in 1828, the oldest woman in the program, a 38-year-old named Claudette, had been part of the system. 9 children had been given birth to by her, only 3 of whom remained at Bellamont. When their value peaked at around age 10, the others had been sold. With a carefully controlled grief that never quite showed on her face, Claudette spoke of them. "You learn to love them in the moment," she told Marie during one of their supervised work sessions in the basement sewing room, a chamber adjacent to the medical area where the women created clothing for themselves and their children. "You love them completely while you have them. And then when Master decides it's time for them to go, you learn to lock that love away in a place where it can't destroy you. You survive by becoming 2 people. The woman who loves her children and the woman who understands they were never truly yours." Far more extensive than that first chamber suggested was the basement complex, discovered Marie. Different purposes were served by a network of rooms: the medical examination room, the delivery room, the nursery where infants stayed for their first months, the sewing room, a small kitchen for preparing the specialized diets the pregnant women received, and even a classroom where the children received basic instruction until age 6. With remarkable efficiency operated the system. That would have impressed any agricultural society were the records maintained by Augustine. He tracked conception rates, birth weights, infant mortality, childhood development milestones, adult health outcomes, and the eventual sale prices of those children he chose to market. Data was shared and methods for improving outcomes were discussed in his correspondence with other plantation owners experimenting with similar programs. Drawings that showed optimal positioning during conception, schedules for maximum fertility, dietary regimens for pregnant women, and treatment protocols for various complications were contained in his filing cabinets. An industrial process for human reproduction, removing every element of chance or individual choice, had he essentially created. 3 weeks after her arrival occurred Marie's first pairing. To a small chamber she hadn't seen before, perhaps 10 foot square, furnished only with a bed and a small table holding a lamp, was she brought. As uncomfortable as she felt was Cyrus, already there. That were both explicit and humiliating were the instructions they were left alone with. In the darkness afterward, lying, Cyrus spoke for the first time. From the Georgia coast where he'd been born, his voice was deep and carried an accent. "This ain't who I am," he said quietly. "What we just done, that wasn't me choosing you, and it wasn't you choosing me. We're both just trying to survive. You understand that?" Grateful for the acknowledgement of their shared helplessness, Marie nodded in the darkness. 7 children I got that I helped make this way, Cyrus continued. Where 5 of them are now, I don't know. One's here working in the fields, old enough now that Master considers him productive. One's just a baby, lives in the nursery downstairs. The others sold off when Master needed cash or made trades with other plantations. He paused and Marie heard the careful control in his voice. "I tell myself I'm keeping them alive by cooperating. If I refuse, Master just picks another man and I get sold or worse. If I fight, it changes nothing except maybe I end up dead. So I do what I'm told, and I try to remember that the children exist, even if I can't be their father in any real way." The first of many was this conversation, whispered in the darkness of that terrible room. Their own community, their own ways of maintaining humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization were developed by the enslaved people caught in Augustine's system. They learned each other's stories, remembered the children who were sold away, marked birthdays and small celebrations when they could, but they also learned to navigate the constant surveillance and documentation. Their cooperation was required by Augustine's system, and a combination of incentives and threats that made resistance nearly impossible had he perfected. Better food, lighter work, and the promise that their children would be trained for skilled positions rather than field labor were received by women in the program. Similar considerations, better quarters, additional rations, and the implicit threat that refusal would mean not just their own suffering, but the selection of other men for the role, were received by the men selected as breeders. With a thoroughness that might have been admirable in another context were the medical aspects of the program overseen by Dr. Prudhomme. He monitored the women's monthly cycles, calculated optimal timing for conception, and prescribed specific herbs and treatments to increase fertility. With careful measurements and observations, every stage was documented by him when pregnancies occurred. The system's strange contradictions were represented by the delivery room. Far superior to typical plantation births were conditions invested in by Augustine. Clean, well-lit, and equipped with medical instruments was the room. Personally attended every delivery by Dr. Prudhomme, applying techniques he'd learned from European medical journals. For particularly difficult births, he used chloroform, employed antiseptic methods that significantly reduced infection rates, and provided post-delivery care that actually prioritized the mother's survival. Mercy wasn't this. Economics was. A significant loss of capital was represented by a dead mother. And reduced the efficiency of the entire system did maternal mortality. Actually lower than the parish average was Bellomont's maternal mortality rate, Augustine's records showed, a statistic he noted with evident pride in his correspondence with other plantation owners. Into the full reality of the system brought Marie her first pregnancy, confirmed by Dr. Prudhomme in July 1837. To the basement complex was she moved, given a private room roughly 8 foot square with a narrow bed, a small table, and a chamber pot. A common area with the other pregnant women was shared by her, a space with several chairs, a table, and shelves holding books that Augustine provided. Encouraged were the women to read, to maintain their health, to avoid stress that might complicate their pregnancies. Carefully structured was the routine. With breakfast brought down by one of the house servants began mornings. Food far superior to standard slave rations, heavy in eggs, milk, and meat. On sewing projects, creating clothing for themselves and the children, would work the women after eating. Every Thursday visited Dr. Prudhomme, conducting examinations that were thorough and humiliating. In the ledgers was documented each woman's progress, weight gain, measurements, fetal position, any concerns or complications. For supervised walks in a small courtyard behind the main house, an area screened from view by carefully placed hedges, allowed afternoons. In circles would walk the women, their swelling bellies marking their purpose, their faces carefully composed to show no emotion. More handwork, light reading if they chose, and eventually sleep in their tiny rooms brought evening. Deliberate was the isolation. Bonds that might lead to coordinated resistance didn't want Augustine the women to form. By the house servants who brought their meals and supplies were monitored conversations. Immediate consequences, reduced rations, confinement to their rooms, or threats of sale after delivery, resulted from any discussion that seemed to trend toward planning or resistance that was quickly reported. Yet ways to communicate were still found by the women, through glances and quiet words during their supervised walks, through notes hidden in sewing projects, through whispered conversations during the chaos of deliveries when supervision was less stringent. They shared strategies for maintaining sanity, meditation techniques, memories to retreat into, ways of mentally separating themselves from what was happening to their bodies. Something of a mentor to Marie and the other younger women became Claudette, the veteran of the system. How to respond to Dr. Prudhomme's examinations was taught by her, cooperative but emotionally absent, giving him no satisfaction beyond the clinical data he sought. How to navigate Augustine's periodic visits was explained by her. To inspect the women monthly would he come down, checking on his investments with the same careful attention he gave his cotton crops. Never meet his eyes, Claudette advised. Look past him, through him. He wants you to acknowledge his power, his control. Don't give him that. You keep your mind somewhere else, somewhere he can't touch. You think about the person you were before this, or the person you might be after. You stay alive inside your head, even when he owns everything else. To a daughter in April 1838 gave birth Marie. 19 hours lasted the labor and was attended by Dr. Prudhomme, 2 midwives from the quarters, and Augustine himself, who observed while making notes in his ever-present ledger. Healthy was the baby, 7 pounds 6 ounces by the doctor's careful measurement. Marie's facial features and what appeared to be Cyrus's robust constitution were had by her. With evident satisfaction examined the infant Augustine, noting various characteristics in his records. Strong bone structure, he commented, good lung capacity based on the strength of her cry, likely to develop into a valuable house servant or breeder herself in 12 to 15 years. I'll call her Desiree. She's exactly what I hoped this pairing would produce. For perhaps an hour held Marie her daughter before the infant was taken to the nursery. On a strict schedule, every 4 hours monitored by one of the midwives would she be allowed to nurse the baby, but otherwise raised communally by enslaved women too old for fieldwork who served as nurses would be the child. Immediate and absolute was the separation. That allowing mothers to bond too closely with their children led to resistance and emotional instability that reduced future fertility had Augustine learned from earlier experiments. 3 months after delivery returned Marie to the pairing rotation. That nursing women were less likely to conceive indicated Augustine's records, so again paired with Cyrus for monthly sessions timed to her cycle was she. Something more akin to industrial manufacturing was turned into human reproduction by the clinical precision of the entire process, the scheduled encounters, the monitored nursing, the documented recovery. 23 women in various stages of pregnancy or recovery housed Bellomont's basement complex by 1840. A crude filing system tracking lineage across 3 generations had the system expanded to include which pairings produced children with desired characteristics and adjust his breeding protocols accordingly could identify Augustine. He discovered, for instance, that premium prices in the New Orleans market commanded children born from pairings between lighter-skinned enslaved people were often purchased for house service in elite establishments were they. Another layer of dehumanization was led to by this. With the same precision he applied to physical measurements began Augustine documenting skin tone. A scale of gradations was created by him and deliberately pairing people to produce children of specific complexions began he. Letters to plantation owners offering to trade enslaved men of particular characteristics, discussing human genetics with the same casual attention others might give to discussing cotton seeds or cattle breeding were included in the correspondence in his files. Entirely secret wasn't the system's existence. What was happening beneath Bellomont's manicured grounds was known or suspected by some neighbors, but within the moral framework of antebellum Louisiana, while extreme, weren't particularly shocking Augustine's activities. To its logical conclusion was he simply taking the premise that enslaved people were property to be managed for maximum return. To study his methods visited Bellomont several other plantation owners and adopted similar systems on their own estates at least 3. Of course knew the enslaved community at Bellomont. For months at a time disappeared into the basement complex and emerged with infants who were taken from them. Did the women in the program live separately? In the quarters at night whispered about it the rest of the enslaved population, but suppressed kept any thought of organized resistance the fear of being sold to worse conditions. That at least the women in the program were well fed and not subjected to the random violence that characterized other plantations was argued by some of the older enslaved people, those who remembered earlier, less systematized brutality. Its own form of control became this rationalization, that systematic exploitation was preferable to chaotic cruelty. Conditions that made the enslaved community complicit in their own oppression deliberately created Augustine by treating those in the breeding program marginally better than field workers. As preferable to the alternatives was viewed by some that selection for the program ensured he from each other and from the broader community kept the women isolated, he prevented the formation of resistance networks. In late 1840 occurred Marie's second pregnancy. A different pairing tried Augustine this time, choosing a man named Thomas who had demonstrated exceptional mathematical ability. Explicit was the calculation. Children capable of serving as bookkeepers or clerk positions that commanded high prices in urban slave markets might be produced by Marie's literacy combined with Thomas's numerical aptitude. Normally preceded the pregnancy until the 7th month when complications that Dr. Prudhomme diagnosed as eclampsia were developed by Marie. For several weeks was uncertain her survival. Through methods that were advanced for the era kept alive, careful management of her diet, enforced rest, and close monitoring. A boy, the baby, delivered premature at 8 months and survived only 3 days. With obvious displeasure recorded the loss Augustine, noting in his ledger the financial impact of the failed pregnancy and Marie's medical expenses, but carefully also documented the medical details, sharing the information with Dr. Prudhomme as they refined their protocols to prevent similar complications in future pregnancies. For months took Marie's recovery, during which kept in the basement complex but not included in the pairing rotation was she. To full-time record-keeping assigned was she during this period, updating the breeding ledgers with new births, recording characteristics of children as they developed, and maintaining the filing system that tracked the entire operation. Access to the full scope of what Augustine had created gave Marie this work. 31 women had participated in the program since its inception in 1828 showed the records. 197 live births had been delivered between them. 87 of those children survived past age 5. $31,400 of documented revenue had been generated by 43 sold at various ages. From various causes had died or worked at Bellamont the remaining children. Augustine's expansion plans also revealed the ledgers. Specifically for the program had he begun purchasing young enslaved women, seeking out those with characteristics he desired: health, intelligence, particular physical features. With slave traders in Virginia who supplied him with women from Upper South estates where natural increase had created surplus populations had he established correspondence. But something else also contained the records. In code that Marie gradually deciphered were small notations. Patterns of resistance was Augustine documenting, not just births and characteristics, which women attempted to induce miscarriages, which became uncooperative after multiple pregnancies, which showed signs of what he termed emotional instability. For sale, typically to plantation owners Augustine knew worked their field laborers to death within a few years, were marked these women. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the system was this: the thoroughness with which Augustine had thought through every element of human response and developed countermeasures. Resistance had he anticipated and built in mechanisms to eliminate it. The psychological toll of the program had he considered and created structures to manage it. A science documented and refined through years of experimentation had he turned the production of human beings into. In 1842 faced Bellamont's system its first serious challenge. A letter to a Catholic priest during a rare visit he made to the plantation to conduct baptisms was managed to be smuggled by an enslaved woman named Julienne, pregnant with her third child through the program. In clumsy French written, described the basement complex and begged for intervention. The letter. By what he read was horrified the priest, Father Antoine Mercier, but also understood he the realities of Louisiana law and social structure. While morally reprehensible, violated no statutes was what Augustine was doing. No legal right to control their own reproduction had enslaved people. That position carried no legal weight in civil matters did the Catholic Church officially oppose the separation of enslaved families. The only thing he could did Father Mercier. To express his concerns visited he Bellamont to confront Augustine directly. In his diary was revealing the conversation as Augustine recorded it. From moral and theological grounds argued the priest that the breeding program violated human dignity and the sanctity of family. With economic and legal arguments countered Augustine, pointing out that slavery itself was based on the premise that enslaved people were property and that managing the reproduction of one's property was an owner's prerogative. With a compromise that changed nothing fundamental about the system ended the discussion. That children born in the breeding program would not be sold before age 12, allowing for longer periods of contact with their mothers, agreed Augustine. To permit Father Mercier to visit the plantation quarterly to provide religious instruction and conduct baptisms also agreed he. To take no further action to expose or interfere with the program agreed the priest in exchange. This accommodation satisfied Father Mercier's conscience while allowing Augustine to continue his operations with minimal modification. In Augustine's favor actually worked the age change. That meant they could be trained in specific skills that increased their value waited until age 12 to sell children. Significantly more at auction commanded a 12-year-old who could read, write, and perform arithmetic than an untrained 10-year-old. From her position maintaining the records witnessed Marie this negotiation. How systems of power protected themselves saw she, how even those who claimed moral objections ultimately accommodated themselves to atrocity when confrontation became too costly. Some comfort to the women in the program brought Father Mercier's quarterly visits, a sympathetic ear, the rituals of faith, a connection to something beyond the basement complex. But a veneer of religious sanction that made resistance seem even more hopeless also gave his presence to the system, legitimizing it. To 3 more children, all by different pairings selected by Augustine, had given birth Marie by 1845. In a state of emotional suspension, performing her duties, maintaining the records while mentally separating herself from the reality those records documented had she learned to exist. Of every child born in the program knew she the names and characteristics, tracked their development and eventual fates, and maintained the filing system that made the entire operation possible. Desiree, now 7, Jean-Baptiste, 5, and the twins, Celine and Claire, 3, were the children she had born, raised in the nursery complex. During Father Mercier's visits and occasionally during supervised time in the courtyard saw Marie them. As instructed, rather than mother, called her Marie. That they belonged to Master DeVoe, that their purpose was to serve profitably, that attachment to any particular adult was discouraged had been taught from infancy to them. Already being trained for house service was Desiree, showing signs of her mother's intelligence and her father's physical strength. Within a few years planned Augustine to place her in his daughter's service, teaching her the skills that would make her valuable as a lady's maid when his daughters eventually married. In Augustine's long-term planning documents was already mapped out the girl's future, serving other white families, possibly bearing children through similar programs if her future owners chose. Different aptitudes showed the twins. When the children were brought to the main house for display to visitors was developing musical talent in Celine, picking out tunes on the piano. The premium he could charge for a musically trained enslaved child was already calculating Augustine. Less obvious talents showed Claire, but the lighter complexion and refined features that commanded high prices in urban markets possessed she. Exactly what Augustine had hoped for Marie's pairing with Thomas was developing into, in contrast, Jean-Baptiste. Able to perform calculations in his head that impressed even Dr. Prudhomme showed the boy remarkable facility with numbers. As a clerk, possibly hiring him out to other plantation owners or businesses in Opelousas, generating steady rental income while retaining ownership planned Augustine to train him. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of Marie's situation was watching her children develop into commodities whose value could be calculated and optimized. Their individual quirks and talents, their emerging personalities could she see, but also saw she how those characteristics were immediately assessed for their market potential. Analyzed, documented, and incorporated into Augustine's breeding calculations for future generations was every trait. Through the 1840s continued the system's expansion. What amounted to an industrial-scale breeding program was operating by Augustine by 1848. Twice had been expanded the basement complex, now including 32 individual rooms, 3 delivery chambers, an enlarged nursery, and additional workspace. To 214 had grown the enslaved population, with 73 of those births occurring through the breeding program. Throughout Louisiana and into neighboring states had spread Augustine's reputation as a successful plantation manager. From other owners seeking advice on implementing similar systems received he regular inquiries. Consulting fees paid by planters from Mississippi, Alabama, and even South Carolina who visited Bellamont to study his methods recorded his ledgers. The facilities, the immaculate records, the well-organized nursery, the healthy appearance of the women in the program would tour these visitors and express admiration for the system's efficiency. Not seem to occur to them did the moral dimensions of what they were witnessing, or if they did, were dismissed as sentimentality inappropriate to business considerations. His impressions in a letter that later surfaced in historical archives recorded one visitor, a planter from Natchez named Horace Sterling. Mr. DeVoe has perfected what others have attempted in crude fashion by applying principles of animal husbandry to the management of colored populations. A self-sustaining labor force that requires minimal external purchase has he created. Remarkable is the attention to detail. For reproductive efficiency is optimized every aspect from nutrition to medical care. Substantial is the initial capital investment, but far exceed traditional cotton cultivation due the returns over 20 years. To implement a similar program at Morningside have I determined. How Augustine's model spread across the Deep South in the 1840s and early 1850s documented this letter and others like it. That at least 15 plantations in Louisiana alone adopted systematic breeding programs based on Bellamont's example suggest conservative estimates. On many more estates likely occurred the practice, but without Augustine's obsessive documentation. Only in the scattered records that survived was documented the human cost of this expansion. Across multiple plantations trapped in these programs were women, their lives reduced to reproductive capacity. From birth for sale or exploitation prepared, raised in nurseries designed to prevent emotional attachment were children. In creating children they would never raise forced to participate were men, their fatherhood reduced to genetic material. Before they could even form were destroyed families. Part of the system for 11 years had been Marie, now 30 years old in 1848. To 7 children had given birth she, 4 of whom survived past infancy. To serve Augustine's eldest daughter, learning the skills that might make her valuable when the daughter eventually married and established her own household had been assigned Desiree, now 10. For various specialized roles that would maximize their value were being trained the other surviving children. But to document everything had also used Marie her position maintaining the records. Over the years, a separate accounting had kept she, not just the clinical details Augustine required, but names, stories, connections. Which children belonged to which mothers knew she, tracked the women who had passed through the system, recorded the sales and separations that Augustine documented so casually in his ledgers. For what to do with this information had no plan she. Northwest legal avenue for challenging the system was there, no outside authority that would intervene on behalf of enslaved people. But some instinct for justice, some need to ensure that what was happening would be remembered drove her to maintain this parallel record in cramped handwriting on scraps of paper she hid beneath the floorboards of her small room. In 1850 changed everything, though not in the way Marie might have hoped. A stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to continue his direct management of the plantation suffered Augustine, now 60 years old. To assume control of the estate had married his eldest daughter, Marguerite, a New Orleans merchant named Philippe Savoy, and the couple moved to Bellemont. 28, ambitious, and eager to prove himself capable of managing the substantial property he'd acquired through marriage was Philippe, who had developed his system over decades of careful experimentation, viewed the breeding program primarily as a source of liquid capital was Philippe, unlike Augustine. To generate cash for expanding Bellemont's cotton operations began immediately selling children at younger ages, 8, 9, 10 years old. The resistance that had been suppressed for so long was sparked by this acceleration of the system's cruelty. The minimal protections Augustine had maintained, children not sold before 12, reasonable spacing between pregnancies, adequate medical care, found the removal to be the breaking point by the women in the program, who had endured years of systematic exploitation. The nucleus of resistance became Claudette, now 51 and considered too old for the breeding program but retained for her sewing skills. The system's entire existence had survived she, had borne 11 children over 23 years, had watched 9 of them sold away. That 23 years of carefully controlled survival had suppressed triggered something in her Philippe's decision to sell her remaining 2 children, boys of 11 and 9 who still lived at Bellemont. Among the women in the program and the broader enslaved community began building a network Claudette over several months in late 1850. Coded in the language of sewing instructions and Bible verses that Father Mercier had taught them was the careful communication. Not escape was the plan that emerged. For women with children, with pregnancies, with tracking systems that would lead to their recapture within days was that impossible. Instead, documentation and exposure was planned. Central to this plan became Marie's hidden records. A comprehensive account of the breeding program began creating between them, Marie and Claudette, names, dates, children born, children sold, the medical procedures, the pairings, everything. In careful French on paper stolen from the record-keeping supplies wrote they, hiding the documents in the one place Philippe and his overseer never thoroughly searched, inside the mattress ticking of the delivery room beds. To somehow get these documents to Father Mercier or to another sympathetic outsider who might use them to expose the system was the plan. Based on the slim chance that public exposure might shame Philippe into ending the program or at least moderating its worst aspects was a desperate hope. But before they could execute this plan, betrayed were they. The plot to Philippe was revealed by one of the house servants, a young woman named Nicolette, who had been promised freedom from the breeding program if she reported resistance. Swift and brutal was the retribution. In the yard before the main house on a cold morning in January 1851 gathered Philippe the entire enslaved population. In chains was brought out Claudette, her face bruised from the beating she'd received. Beside her was forced to stand Marie, also chained. Brief and calculated was Philippe's speech. The hidden documents held he up, describing them as evidence of a conspiracy to steal plantation records and forge papers for escape. The actual content of the documents, the detailed accounting of the breeding program, didn't mention he. That truth couldn't be acknowledged publicly, even as he punished those who had documented it. The next day was sold Claudette to a cotton factor Philippe knew in Avoyelles Parish, a man whose plantation was notorious for working field laborers to death within 3 to 4 years. To different buyers were sold separately Claudette's 2 remaining children, ensuring she would never know what became of them. because her literacy made her valuable for maintaining records, was not sold Marie, but removed from record-keeping duties and placed into the pairing rotation full-time. Various punishments were subjected to the other women suspected of involvement in the documentation effort: separation from their children, assignment to fieldwork despite pregnancies, reduction of rations, and implied threats of sale to worse situations. Clear was the message. Consequences that extended beyond the individual to their children and anyone they cared about would be met by resistance. Also made changes to the physical system did Philippe. To increase surveillance was reorganized the basement complex. To live in the complex full-time, monitoring the women's activities and conversations was assigned a house servant. Eliminated were the courtyard walks. Removed from the common area were books. Beyond their assigned sewing work and no opportunity for conversation that wasn't supervised were to have the women no occupation. When he arrived for his next quarterly visit, was informed that the women were unavailable for his religious instruction, an illness, Philippe claimed, that made gathering them unsafe. Father Mercier. This explanation accepted the priest, and increasingly perfunctory became his visits to Bellemont. At all stopped he coming within a year. The destruction of documentation and the suppression of resistance might have been the end of the story. But attention that Augustine's more careful management had avoided was drawn by Philippe's expansion of the breeding program and his aggressive sales of its products. 3 to 4 children per year at the New Orleans slave market was selling Bellemont by 1853, and the pattern, children of similar ages, excellent health, specialized training, began attracting notice from people opposed to slavery. Information about Bellemont's unusual production of premium enslaved children was obtained by an abolitionist newspaper in New York and published an article suggesting systematic breeding operations on southern plantations. Sensationalized and lacked specific details was the article, but prompted investigations by northern religious organizations and even some concern among moderate Southerners who found distasteful the explicit treatment of human reproduction as industrial manufacturing. By becoming more secretive about his operations, responded Philippe. Across multiple markets and conducted through intermediaries were spread sales. Only through the main house behind locked doors with no external evidence of its existence was accessed the basement complex. The cotton operations, the impressive main house, the well-maintained quarters were shown visitors to Bellemont, but never the underground chambers where the breeding program continued. Its third generation had produced Bellemont's breeding program by 1860, as sectional tensions pushed the nation toward war. Adults were now children who had been born in the system, some of them selected for the program themselves. Extensive enough to track hereditary traits across multiple generations were now the genetic charts Augustine had begun, something that fascinated Philippe from a purely commercial standpoint. Disrupted but didn't immediately end the system did the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. Under Union control fell Louisiana relatively early in the war, with New Orleans occupied in 1862. But St. Landry Parish in the heart of Louisiana's plantation belt remained under Confederate authority until late in the war. To maintain the program struggled Philippe during these years as the plantation's economy collapsed. Couldn't be sold cotton and dried up the cash flow that had funded the breeding operations costs. No better than field workers were receiving rations the women in the program by 1863. Sporadic became medical care. In 1863 died Dr. Prudhomme, elderly and in poor health, and was not replaced. Through a combination of luck and her continued usefulness survived Marie the war years, maintaining what remained of the plantation's records. 43 was she now, past the age for the breeding program, but valuable for her literacy and organizational skills. Responsible for documenting the plantation's collapse became she as Bellemont's systems fell apart, tracking which enslaved people had fled to Union lines, which remained, what resources still existed. In April 1865 came the end. St. Landry Parish was occupied by Union troops and arrived at Plantation's federal officials to announce emancipation and begin registration of formerly enslaved people. Among those who gave testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau agents about conditions at Bellemont was Marie, but in detail was not recorded her testimony and that of the other women from the breeding program. As just another aspect of slavery's general brutality treated the Freedmen's Bureau agents, overwhelmed with the task of managing newly freed populations across the entire South, plantation breeding programs. That children had been sold, that families had been separated, that women had been forced to bear children documented they, but didn't capture the systematic, multi-generational, scientifically managed nature of what had occurred at Belmont. Largely destroyed was the breeding program's documentary evidence, Augustine's careful records, Philippe's ledgers, Marie's hidden accounts. Before fleeing to New Orleans as Union troops approached, burned most of the basement complex's records did Philippe. Among various archives survived some documents, scattered, but for decades would not be pieced together the full scope of what had occurred. In Opelousas spent Marie the remaining years of her life, working as a seamstress and attempting to locate the children who had been sold away from Belmont. Of her 7 children found she 3, Desiree, now living in New Orleans and working as a domestic servant, Jean-Baptiste, who had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi and made his way back to Louisiana after the war, and one of the twins, Claire, who had been sold to a New Orleans household and gained some education. Never located she the other 4 children, including one twin, Celine. In Augustine's carefully documented records existed their births and characteristics noted, their sale prices recorded, but into the chaos of war and emancipation disappeared their ultimate fates. Until her death in 1879 searched for them Marie, placing advertisements in newspapers, writing to Freedmen's Bureau offices across the South, following every lead that might reunite her with the children whose births she had been forced to produce. Across Louisiana and beyond after emancipation scattered the other women from Belmont's breeding program. Like Marie, stayed in the area, attempting to rebuild lives and locate lost children, some. Fled others, wanting nothing that might remind them of the years spent in the basement complex. Dissolved as they pursued individual paths toward freedom did the community they had formed, the whispered conversations, the shared strategies for survival, the mutual recognition of their particular form of suffering. An old records building was preparing to demolish the St. Landry Parish Courthouse in 1893 when a water-damaged trunk containing documents from various plantations was discovered by a clerk. Among them were fragments of Augustine DeVoe's breeding records, perhaps 20 pages that had somehow escaped Philippe's destruction. A young man named Etienne Guidry, who had been born enslaved himself, was the clerk, and recognized what he was reading and brought the documents to the attention of black community leaders in Opelousas. A difficult decision was faced by these leaders. A particularly horrifying aspect of slavery's systematic dehumanization would document publishing the records, but also expose the intimate details of violations experienced by women who were still living, some of whom had tried to build new lives without the shadow of their enslavement defining them. To seal the documents in the courthouse vault with instructions that they not be opened without permission from the victims or their direct descendants was the decision made. In 1897 emerged additional testimony when a visiting historian from Boston interviewed elderly formerly enslaved people in St. Landry Parish for a project documenting slavery's legacies. Recorded testimony gave 3 women who had been part of Belmont's breeding program, the first time their experiences were captured in their own words rather than through the clinical documentation of their enslavers. In painful detail described these testimonies, preserved in the archives of the Boston Historical Society, the breeding program's operation. Of the medical examinations, the forced pairings, the systematic separation from children, and the psychological strategies the women developed to survive speak they. Also describe they the aftermath, the decades spent searching for lost children, the difficulty of forming romantic relationships after years of systematized sexual exploitation, the nightmares and flashbacks that pursued them long after emancipation. People think freedom means you leave the past behind, but how do you leave behind children you bore? How do you forget years spent in rooms underground? Your body used like a machine. I am free now. Yes, I own my labor. Choose my life. Walk where I please. But some part of me is still in that basement. Still waiting for the next examination. Still counting days between forced meetings with men I didn't choose. Freedom is supposed to heal everything. But there are wounds that stay open forever, told the historian one woman, Ellen Marshall, formerly enslaved at Belmont, now 72. Not unique was the breeding program at Belmont. Where similar systematic breeding operations occurred between 1820 and 1865 have identified historical research at least 33 plantations across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina. The concept was not Augustine DeVoe's innovation, but the thoroughness of documentation and the pseudoscientific approach he applied to what was already common practice. Straightforward was the economic incentive. As the legal international slave trade ended, dramatically increased the value of enslaved people in the decades leading up to the Civil War. The primary source of new enslaved workers became natural increase. A significant economic advantage possessed plantation owners who could efficiently produce healthy enslaved children for their own use or for sale. But incalculable is the human cost of this efficiency. Under systematic supervision, forced to bear children were thousands of women. From birth to understand themselves as commodities were raised tens of thousands of children. According to breeding charts and economic calculations, were prevented from forming or torn apart families. Across generations extended the psychological trauma. Throughout their lives bore the mark of their origin, children born in these programs, and passed that legacy to their own descendants. Deliberately obscured was the full scope of what occurred in places like Belmont's basement complex. Only fragmentary references to the breeding program contain the court records from St. Landry Parish, and most of those focus on property disputes rather than the experiences of those enslaved. Much of the direct evidence eliminated the destruction of documentation by former slaveholders after the war. From scattered sources have had to piece together the story: historians, fragments of plantation records, Freedmen's Bureau testimonies, oral histories collected decades after emancipation, court cases involving property claims, and the few detailed accounts like those from Belmont. Accidental wasn't this systematic obscuring of evidence. That what they were doing would be condemned by history understood at some level the people who operated breeding programs. To prevent future judgment was an attempt their destruction of records and suppression of testimony. But to document the reality that thousands of enslaved women experienced survived enough evidence, the reduction of human reproduction to industrial process managed with ledgers and charts and medical protocols that stripped away every element of choice, dignity, and human connection. One of the most detailed accountings of a breeding program's operations provide Marie's hidden records, discovered during the courthouse demolition. A record that resisted the erasure her enslavers attempted created her careful documentation of names, births, characteristics, and sales. For understanding how systematic the exploitation of enslaved women's reproduction had become provided crucial evidence those records when finally opened to researchers in 1962, following permission from Marie's surviving descendants. 73 years later in 1962 was finally released the testimony sealed in 1893, as part of the growing historical research into slavery's realities that accompanied the civil rights movement. A 94-year-old woman living in California who had been born in the basement complex in 1868 during the program's final years remained alive by then, only one survivor of Belmont's breeding program. A recorded interview in 1963, a year before her death, gave this woman, Louise Thibodeau, about growing up knowing her mother had been forced to bear children for profit. Spoke she, about the difficulty of establishing her own identity separate from that origin, about the generational trauma that marked her family. About resilience also spoke she, how the community of people who had survived the breeding program and their descendants supported each other, created new families, built lives that affirmed their humanity in the face of systematic attempts to deny it. That's what I remember most, recalled Louise in that interview. Not the horror of where I came from, but the strength of the women who survived it. They were more than what was done to them. We all are. Like all histories of systematic exploitation, demands remembering precisely because those who perpetrated it attempted erasure. This story, more than the clinical notation in ledgers or the brief mentions in court records, deserved the women who endured Belmont's breeding program. To have their experiences documented, their resistance acknowledged, their survival celebrated, deserve they. During the 1890s, when the property changed hands, was filled in the basement complex at Belmont. In the 1930s fell into disrepair and was demolished the main house. Agricultural land is the site today, showing no evidence of what occurred beneath its surface. But in archives, in testimonies, in the genealogical searches of descendants still trying to piece together families torn apart by systematic breeding programs, persists the record. Not because it represents the worst of slavery's horrors, though it certainly represents some of the most systematic dehumanization, matters this history, but because it reveals the logic of treating human beings as property carried to its rational conclusion. A respected member of his society was Augustine Deveau, not a monster apart from it. To human beings applying techniques of animal husbandry because his legal and social system told him enslaved people were property to be managed for profit. Forms of resistance that history sometimes fails to recognize demonstrated the women who survived his system, who endured the forced pregnancies and systematized sexual exploitation and separation from their children. Survived they? In the face of systematic attempts to reduce them to reproductive machinery, maintained they their humanity. To love their children even when those children would be sold away, found ways. Among themselves created community despite efforts to isolate them. When they could documented their experiences, leaving testimony for future generations. And when freedom came, decades searching for lost children, rebuilding families, creating lives that affirmed the value and dignity they had been denied, spent they. As important to remember as the horror they endured is that survival, that insistence on humanity in the face of dehumanization. A logical extension of slavery's premise was what happened in the basement at Belmont, not an aberration. The systematic nature of the exploitation, rather than dismissing it as the act of individual villains, is essential to understanding American history, understanding that, confronting. Far beyond the individuals who directly experienced them, extended the legacy of these breeding programs, shaping family structures, community bonds, and generational trauma across the descendants of those who survived. The sealed testimony from St. Landry Parish, the fragmentary records preserved in various archives, and the oral histories collected over decades provide evidence of what occurred. But behind that evidence are thousands of individual stories, women forced to bear children they would lose, children raised to understand themselves as commodities, men coerced into creating families they couldn't protect, and communities torn apart by the systematic application of economic logic to human reproduction. To recognize resilience, not to create despair, deserve remembering these stories. Didn't just endure the survivors of Belmont's breeding program and similar systems across the South. In countless small ways resisted they, maintained their humanity, created beauty and meaning despite systematic attempts to reduce them to economic units. That insistence on dignity and human value carry forward their descendants, including those still searching genealogical records, trying to piece together family connections severed by systematic breeding programs. The story that the court records from 1934 began to reveal is this, not just what happened in the basement at Belmont, but why it happened, how it was sustained, who resisted, and what legacy it left. As historians and descendants work to document what systematic breeding programs meant for the individuals and families who experienced them, continues the full accounting. With a truth that demands acknowledgement, speak across the decades the voices of those women, preserved in testimony and fragmentary records. We were more than what was done to us, and our stories will not be erased. What do you think about this dark chapter of American history? How should we remember the thousands of women who endured systematic breeding programs? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you or made you think differently about the realities of American slavery, please like this video and share it with others who need to hear these voices from the past. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more stories that history tried to bury. These voices deserve to be heard, and these stories need to be told. See you in the next video.